Okay, so good morning, everyone. And we'll begin, as usual, with recitation of some prayers and generating a positive motivation. And then we'll do a short meditation on the topic we looked at last week, the 3 types of suffering that are kind of general sufferings of samsara, cyclic existence. So we'll try to look at that and understand that more clearly. So could we have the prayers on the screen? So if you can, it's good to imagine the Buddha in front of you while reciting these prayers. Even if you have difficulty visualizing, try to at least feel the presence of the Buddha there. A presence with incredible kindness and compassion, love, and all other positive qualities, wisdom, understanding the true nature of all things, totally free of all negative thoughts, attitudes, emotions. So a completely purified and completely perfected being there in the space in front of you, radiating his love and compassion for you and all other beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. For the prayer of the 4 immeasurable thoughts, we'll just pause briefly after each line to try to really generate that particular attitude in our mind towards all living beings, or as many as you can. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Next is the 7-limb prayer. This contains the most important practices for accumulating merit, positive energy, and purifying negative energy. So these are 2 things we need to do for our mind to be able to make progress along the path to enlightenment. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind, and present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined, I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. And the mandala offering is to imagine the entire universe, all the most beautiful, precious, enjoyable things in the universe, collecting all these together, transforming them into a pure land, mentally offering them to the Buddha and all the holy objects for the benefit of all beings. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niratayami. So let's recite the mantra of the Buddha 3 times and imagine light radiating from the Buddha and going into you and going into all other living beings as well. And the light fills you completely and purifies all negative thoughts, negative energy, so all physical and mental problems and difficulties, these get purified. And the light also nourishes our positive potential. So all the good qualities that we have, compassion, love, wisdom, and so on. We do have these qualities, but they just need to be nourished so they can grow more and more. So imagine the light from the Buddha pouring water on and nourishing these seeds of positive qualities so that they can grow and help us get closer to enlightenment. Tayata Om Muni Muni Maha Munaye Soha. 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 So now filled and nourished with this light, this positive energy from the Buddha, try to ensure that your motivation for being here, participating in this session, this class or talk, is altruistic, that you're thinking not just of yourself, your own needs and wishes. Of course, that is important, but it's good to open our minds and our hearts and think of others, all living beings if possible. They all want to be happy just as we do. They all want to be free of suffering just as we do. And everyone deserves to be happy, and nobody should have to suffer. So try to generate the wish that this class that we're doing right now will bring benefit to all living beings. It will help all living beings find their way out of suffering and its causes and help them all achieve happiness. especially the higher forms of happiness, all the way up to full enlightenment, Buddhahood. So may this be a contribution to that. Okay, so let's do some meditation on the 3 types of suffering that were explained in last week's class. So it said that all the different types of suffering, problems, unsatisfactory experiences in samsara, cyclic existence, can be included in these 3. So it's a good way to get an understanding of how samsara is really unsatisfying, really something to free ourselves from. So the first of the 3 is called the suffering of suffering. And this refers to experiences that we have that are obviously painful. So these can happen on the physical level. So physical pain, sickness, discomfort, anywhere from just a mild feeling of hunger or thirst or heat or cold, all the way up to severe pain that we experience in our bodies. This type of suffering also includes mental suffering, mental problems or emotional problems. So this can be anywhere from just feeling a little bit irritated or bored or unsatisfied, all the way up to, again, very severe feelings of depression or despair, or even wanting to end our lives because we're so unhappy. So there's a whole range of different experiences included in this first type of suffering. So just think of some examples from your own life and or from the lives of other people you know or you've heard of, just to get a better understanding of this first type of suffering. So this first type of suffering is easy to understand. Even animals and small children recognize that they have physical and mental unhappiness and discomfort and want to avoid it. The second type of suffering is more subtle, more difficult to understand. It's called the suffering of change. And it refers to experiences that we normally consider pleasant ones, happiness, good experiences. But because they don't last, they last only a few seconds or a few minutes or maybe a few hours. But sooner or later they come to an end and we're back where we were before, still feeling unsatisfied and still having the same problems we had before. So a good example of this is eating. Most people enjoy eating food, and we need to eat food to survive. So when we're eating food, it's a pleasant experience. Our stomach gets filled, our hunger goes away, we enjoy the tastes of the food and so on. But how long does that enjoyment last? As soon as we finish eating, then that pleasure ends. And a few hours later, we're hungry again. We have to eat again. So that's one example, but maybe you can think of other examples on your own of pleasant experiences you've had that don't last, come to an end, disappear, and leave you back where you were before with the same problems, same difficulties you had before. So the point is that even when it comes to the pleasant experiences in samsara, they are impermanent, transitory, they don't last. They don't bring long-term and genuine happiness and satisfaction. There is such a thing. There does exist genuine, long-lasting happiness outside of samsara. When one reaches nirvana or enlightenment, there the happiness doesn't come to an end, it lasts, it just goes on and on. But as long as we're in samsara, all the pleasures we have, even if they last a long time, eventually come to an end. They don't completely remove our suffering and causes of suffering. So this is not easy to understand. We need to take time to think more about it and deepen our understanding of it. And then the third of the three types of suffering is even more difficult to understand. It's called pervasive compounded suffering. And it refers to our very existence, having this body and mind, what are called aggregates in Buddhism, but basically just this body-mind combination that we have that come into existence due to imperfect causes and conditions. It's not that we were created by a perfect divine creator, but karma and afflictions, especially ignorance, are the causes for this body-mind combination to come into existence. And so the causes of our existence are imperfect, faulty, and therefore our body and mind are said to be contaminated or polluted and not completely pure and perfect. And so while we have this body and mind, they're like a magnet for sufferings, for problems, right from the beginning of our life, birth, and then growing, having growing pains, and getting sick, and eventually getting old and dying, and having all the other kinds of problems we have in our life. So all of these occur because the very basis of our life, this body-mind combination, is faulty. So the causes are faulty. While we live, our existence is faulty. And then while we live, going through life, we create more causes of suffering. We're perpetuating our suffering into the future. So the whole basis of our life, the whole basis of our existence is faulty and naturally brings suffering. It's the basis for suffering, for problems. So the reason this third type of suffering is called pervasive compounded suffering, it's pervasive because it pervades the whole of samsara. Now, all the living beings in samsara, from the depths of the really unfortunate realms like the hells, all the way up to the most wonderful realms of the gods. So all beings and their entire existence within samsara is pervaded by this this situation of being caused by faulty causes, ignorance, delusions, and karma. So these three types of suffering continue to happen to us as long as we're in samsara. We're never completely free of them. There may be times when we have no suffering of suffering, but we have the other two most of the time. And there's always the seeds in our mind to again experience suffering when conditions come together. The suffering again happens to us. So just ask yourself, if there's an alternative, which there is, according to the Buddha, there is an alternative to samsara, and that is freedom, liberation, nirvana, being completely free of samsara and all the sufferings of samsara, all the problems of samsara, and its very causes. So such a state exists. It's possible. We can do it. We can get there. So just ask yourself if that is something you would like to do, something you aspire to. So this topic is not easy. The first of the three types of suffering, that's easy to recognize. Everybody recognizes that. But the other two are more subtle and takes time and thinking and contemplating to understand what they mean and to come to see that the whole of samsara, the whole of cyclic existence, not just ourself, our own experience, but that of all other beings in samsara, that we are afflicted by these different kinds of sufferings. And they sometimes say samsara is like a prison. And for me, that analogy is very helpful because, for one thing, nobody likes a prison. Nobody likes to be locked up and not have their freedom. So I think just the word prison or the thought of prison probably makes us shiver. It's definitely something we don't want. And then I think of these, this is just my own analogy, the three types of suffering being three different kinds of experiences that a person may have in a prison. So in a prison, some of the experiences you have are horrible because there's really nasty, violent people around you, fellow prisoners, and even some of the guards. So they can be really malicious and nasty. And so, you know, if you run into that kind of experience of being mistreated by someone else in the prison, that's like the first type of suffering. You know, it's a really awful experience. Or maybe you're put in solitary confinement for days or weeks at a time, and you're all by yourself 23 hours a day in a little cell. So that's pretty awful. And then, but sometimes in a prison, you probably have pleasant experiences. Maybe on Christmas, you know, you have a special meal. And maybe sometimes a movie, you get to watch a movie, a really interesting, exciting movie. Or you have visits from your family, your friends, your loved ones. So during those kinds of experiences, you may even forget that you're in prison. You're feeling really happy and enjoying yourself, even though you are in prison, but temporarily you forget about that and you just enjoy yourself. But those experiences come to an end. And there you are, back where you were before. You're still in prison. So those kinds of experiences, I think, are like the second type of suffering, the suffering of change. Pleasant experiences that we can have within samsara, but they don't last. They only last a short period of time, and then they go away, they disappear, and we're still where we were before. And then just the fact of being in prison itself, being locked up in this structure, this building or this compound, you know, with walls and barbed wire and bars on the windows and locks on the doors and all the guards and so on, security cameras, all these things are just designed to make sure you stay in the prison and you can't get out. So just that situation itself is painful, is horrible. So that's similar to the third type of suffering. You know, just being in samsara, we are not free. We're not free to enjoy the happiness, the bliss that we have the potential to enjoy. You know, we could experience unbelievable happiness and bliss that just goes on and on and on. It doesn't disappear after a few seconds or after a few minutes. So we have the potential to have that kind of experience. But we don't have that kind of experience. And the reason is because we are locked in to the prison of our, basically our afflictive emotions and our karma. So our afflictive emotions include ignorance, attachment, anger, jealousy, and so on. There's a whole bunch of these afflictions or delusions. And so they are in our mind and we're never completely free of them, even though there may be moments when they're not kind of coming up and making us crazy, but the seeds are there. So sooner or later they come up again and again and again and again. And then there's our karma, the karmic seeds of actions that we did in the past, not just this lifetime, but many, many lives before. So those seeds are still there in our mind. When causes and conditions come together, the seeds ripen and we find ourselves having an experience. If it's a negative karmic seed, then the experience will be something painful, something we don't want to have, like a sickness or losing a loved one or losing our health or our job or some prized possession. Okay, so we just run into these unpleasant, unwanted experiences again and again and again because we have the seeds to have those experiences in our mind. And then we're, you know, because our mind is so afflicted by ignorance and the other emotions, disturbing emotions, we keep creating more karma all the time. So some of our karma is finishing, but more karma is being created all the time. So it's like, not that we're doing it deliberately, consciously, but the factors are there. The causes and conditions are there for us to continue creating the causes of suffering. And that means perpetuating our existence in samsara. And so going forward, what we will probably have is many more lifetimes in samsara, many more problems, many more unpleasant experiences. So it's like we are in a prison. We are in this prison, and the walls and guards and so on keeping us in this prison are our own mental afflictions and karma. Okay. So that's how I think of that analogy of being in a prison, and then the three types of suffering as three different kinds of experiences in a prison. Because even when a prisoner has a pleasant experience, like watching a good movie or eating a good meal or having a visit from a loved one, it's a nice experience, but it doesn't last. It comes to an end, and they're still there in that unpleasant situation, counting the days, counting the months, counting the years before they get out. But in some cases, they're in for life, or they're sentenced to death, so they're never really going to get out. Physically, they may not be able to get out, but mentally, Some prisoners are very fortunate to learn spiritual teachings. We know a lot of prisoners who've learned the Dharma, practicing the Dharma, and mentally they're quite happy. It's kind of amazing that you can be happy in prison, but it does happen just by learning methods such as those found in the Dharma. Okay, so we've been, for the last couple of weeks, looking at all these different kinds of suffering or unsatisfactory experiences that are part of samsara. And as I've said before, it's really important to look at these, think about these, meditate on these. But the purpose is not to make us suffer more. So be very clear about that. We're not trying to cause more suffering to ourselves. Instead, the purpose is to give rise to the wish to get out of samsara, the aspiration to be free, the determination to be free, which is called renunciation. Renunciation, or the determination to be free. So this is a state of mind that realizes samsaric existence is completely unsatisfactory, and I don't want to be here. I don't deserve to be here. I want to get out, and I'll do whatever I can to get out. And this state of mind could also be called self-compassion. Normally, it's not called that in the traditional teachings, but looking at the description of it and what's involved in it, it is like self-compassion, but it's the most supreme form of self-compassion. It's not self-compassion that's just kind of being nice to yourself and taking bubble baths and, eating the food you like to eat and so on. But it's realizing we are in a situation of suffering, and it's a very imperfect, very unsatisfactory situation. And we shouldn't have to stay here. We should get out. We should get ourselves out of this situation. We should free ourselves from all the different kinds of suffering and the very causes that keep us in samsara. This is something we deserve, and we want to do it, and we will do it, okay? So it is like self-compassion, compassion for oneself, wanting oneself to be free of suffering, to not suffer, and to get out of suffering altogether. And we need to generate this attitude towards ourselves, because later in the great scope, when we go on to the great scope, we're going to develop that same attitude for all other sentient beings who are in samsara. So if we fail to do this for ourselves, if we don't even realize that we deserve to get out of samsara, and we're going to make sure we do that, then we won't be able to feel that way towards all other sentient beings, which is what we do with bodhicitta. So it's really, really important to spend time on this middle scope of the path and really understand samsara, how imperfect it is, how problematic it is, how horrible it is. It's like being in a prison, so that we generate a strong determination to get ourselves out of this experience. And then it becomes much easier to generate that same feeling towards other sentient beings when we get to the great scope. So today we'll move on to, so up to now we've been mainly looking at the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, and many, many different examples of suffering. Now we'll move on to the second noble truth, the causes of suffering. Okay, so we can have the slides. Next page. So we looked at the Four Noble Truths back in the beginning of this course, I think in the first talk. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said this is the best way to introduce Buddhism to newcomers, to beginners, people who don't know about Buddhism. It's good to start with the Four Noble Truths. But that doesn't mean it's just for beginners. It's actually very, very profound. So it's good to kind of look at, think about, meditate on the Four Noble Truths again and again, because each time we get a deeper understanding of them. And as our understanding and experience of these teachings grow, we'll understand the Four Noble Truths in deeper ways. So the first is suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and we have looked at many different examples of that, like the 6 types of suffering, the 8 types of suffering, the 3 types of suffering, the suffering specific to individual realms. So each realm within samsara, each place where you could be born in samsara, has its own particular kinds of sufferings. And so again, the point is to recognize that wherever you're born in samsara, even in the highest realm in samsara is called the peak of samsara. like the penthouse of samsara. And it's the highest of the formless realms. You don't even have a body. You don't even have a physical body. So there's no physical suffering. And there's no gross mental suffering. Your whole life passes just in a meditative bliss. Your mind is in a state of bliss all the time, deeply absorbed in meditation. But it's transitory, it's temporary. It lasts a long time, but eventually it comes to an end. That wonderful experience comes to an end. And then you're still in the round of death and rebirth. And eventually you might find yourself back in the lower realms. So that's really important to understand, because in non-Buddhist traditions, like in Hinduism, they do know how to cultivate samadhi or concentration and how to achieve those higher realms. And sometimes people think that's it. You know, once you reach those higher realms, that's nirvana. You're free. You're free of all suffering. And it can seem that way because it lasts such a long time and you don't have any gross suffering. But according to Buddhism, you haven't really freed yourself from samsara. You're still in samsara. You're still in the circle of dying and being reborn. So, yeah, again, the point is really become convinced that there's no place in samsara where you're totally free of suffering. And so the only choice then is to get out of samsara. And to do that, we have to eliminate the causes of suffering. So as long as the causes of suffering are still there in our minds, we will be bound to the wheel of life, the wheel of samsara. So that's what needs to be overcome, the causes of suffering. So basically, the main causes of suffering are these 2 things, karma and delusions. And the main of those 2, the main is delusions. These are sometimes called afflictive emotions or disturbing emotions. These are attitudes within our mind that lead us to create the cause of suffering again and again. And they themselves are also suffering, as we'll look at. You know, having those in our mind, especially when they're strong and our mind is really caught up in them, then that itself is suffering. So we'll start looking at those today. And then the third of the 4 truths is the cessation of suffering, also known as nirvana or liberation. And so this is the state where one is totally free of suffering and its causes forever, such that they will never come back. And sometimes this may seem kind of abstract or distant and hard to relate to, but we might get a sense of this if we can bring to mind times when our mind has been relatively calm and peaceful and clear. I think we do all have moments of that. For example, when we're out in nature and, you know, in a beautiful, beautiful place, like a forest or up on a mountain, watching a sunset or a sunrise, and the whole environment just seems so pure and so peaceful, and our mind is not kind of all caught up in worries and anger and desire. And maybe just for a few moments or even for one moment, you know, we have this sense of peace and calmness and clarity and joy. And no gross mental suffering happening at those moments. So I think everyone does have moments like that. Or maybe after a massage, if you have a really good massage and sort of all the tension in your body just disappears and your mind also gets really calm and clear. Or sometimes in meditation. Sometimes when we're meditating, we have moments of peace and calm and no gross physical or mental suffering happening. So if we can remember those times, that gives us a little taste of nirvana. It's not nirvana, but just what it's like to not have suffering, and also to not have the mental afflictions in our mind that are screaming at us or screaming at the world and just making our mind really unpeaceful. So when there's moments of freedom from that, that's just a little bit like nirvana. And then imagine that kind of experience multiplied a gazillion times and then going on and on and on, moment by moment, not disappearing after a few seconds, but just continuous. That becomes your default mode. So if we think in that way, we can get just a little sense of what nirvana is like. Sound good? And then the fourth is the path that leads to that cessation. So what do we need to do in order to reach nirvana? And it's basically three things: cultivating ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So we'll look at that more later. Okay, the next slide shows a partial picture. I couldn't fit the whole thing in. The head got cut off. But anyway, this is the famous Wheel of Life, which you usually find painted on a Tibetan temple. Sometimes it's on the porch or the veranda before you go into the temple. Sometimes it's in the back of the room. So it's often used in Tibetan Buddhism, but apparently the origin is from the time of the Buddha, when king had this painting made and offered it to another king. And anyway, there's some kind of story about that. So it shows different aspects of samsara, the main big parts of the wheel, which are kind of correspond to the spokes. Like if this was a bicycle wheel, the spokes of the wheel, the large parts, show the 6 different realms. The God realms are up in the top, and the hell realms are down at the bottom, and the other realms are on the sides. And then around the edge, where the actual tire would be, if this was a bicycle wheel, that shows the 12 links. And we'll look at that later. That's the actual process of how samsara works, how we keep creating the causes and taking rebirth in samsara again and again. And then right in the middle of the wheel, the hub of the wheel, this shows the causes of suffering. So we'll look at that in the next slide in more detail. And the idea of a wheel is, so the idea of a wheel is interesting because I think in the West, a lot of people think of evolution in a linear way. Yeah, there's this idea that, human beings started off like, very primitive, just a little bit above monkeys. And then we've been getting better and better and smarter, and we're just going to get better. As time goes on, the human race is going to get more and more intelligent, more and more compassionate, more and more, better qualities. Although it's quite doubtful when you look at what's going on in the world today. But anyway, according to Buddhism, it's not like that. We don't just get better and better, but we keep going around in circles. So there are times in our existence in samsara, there are times when we are highly evolved, even better than human beings. We're in the God realms, where they have much more merit, much less suffering and negativity, much more virtue. They're much more, mentally developed, spiritually developed. But you're in that situation for a while, but then because we haven't eliminated the causes of suffering are still there. They may be buried deep in our mind, but they're still there. They haven't been overcome. So eventually they come up again, and we find ourselves back in the wheel, taking rebirth even in unfortunate realms where we're, very primitive again, primitive and deluded and non-virtuous and so on. So it's like a Ferris wheel or like a merry-go-round. being stuck on that wheel and never able to completely get off. So we go from high to low, and then from low to high, and then back to low again, and around and around and around, like a rat race. So yeah, if you think about that, that being trapped in this kind of wheel is not satisfying, and we want to get ourselves off. So the way to be free is to overcome the causes of suffering. So there are two main causes of suffering: karma, which we looked at a little bit, not in great detail during the previous part of this course. It's in the small scope, but yeah, it's really good to study karma, to learn more about karma, and then really try to live your life in accordance with karma, which mainly means refraining from non-virtuous karma, bad karma, trying to not create bad karma as much as you can. It's almost impossible to completely avoid that, but we at least do our best. And then create virtue, create virtuous karma, good karma as much as we can. So, we need to learn what is good karma, what is bad karma, and really try to live our life according to that. And then, of course, there's purification of the karma, the bad karma we created in the past, and we might still be creating even now. And then, really try our best going forward to make sure the karma we create is positive, virtuous karma, and not negative, non-virtuous karma. But the main cause of suffering is the second one, delusions or afflictions. So these are mental states. They are characterized by not seeing things realistically. Delusion is deluded. That's why I like the word delusion, because it's deluded. It's seeing things in a mistaken way, in an unrealistic way. And they also have the effect of causing our mind to be disturbed. Whenever a delusion or an affliction is in our mind is not peaceful and calm and clear. It's disturbed, like muddy water, right? Our mind can be clear, like clear water, but when there's delusions in the mind, it stirs up all the mud. So our mind is muddy, unclear, difficult to see things clearly and correctly. And then they often, but not always, but they often lead us to engage in actions which are often non-virtuous, negative. And then that, again, becomes the cause for more suffering. So that's why delusions are the main cause of suffering, because they said, if we didn't have delusions in our mind, we wouldn't create bad karma. We wouldn't, create the negative karma that causes us to have problems and suffering and samsara. So that's the main cause of suffering. And there are many delusions, but the main ones are what are called the three poisons of greed or attachment. There's different terms for that. Desire, craving. And in the picture, so this is a close-up of the hub of the wheel of life. In the very center, it shows these three animals. These symbolize or represent the three poisons. So there's a bird. Some say it's a pigeon, or I don't know, some kind of bird. And that represents attachment. And then the second of the three poisons is hatred or anger or aversion. And that's represented by a snake. And then the third one is ignorance of the true nature of things. And that's the main one. That's represented by the pig. And the other two animals, the bird and the snake, are depicted coming out of the mouth of the snake. So that means that ignorance is actually the root, the cause of the other two, and also all the other afflictive emotions. So that's the main one. So let's look more closely at ignorance and what ignorance is all about. And the word ignorance can mean different things. So could we have the next slide? So the word ignorance can mean different things, but there is a kind of ignorance which is called the root of samsara, the root cause, the source of samsara and all its suffering. And within Buddhism, there's different schools of philosophy that have some different explanations of things. And so other schools might explain ignorance in different ways. What is the root of samsara? There are different versions of it. But the school of philosophy that most Tibetans, as I understand, favor is called the Madhyamika, actually Madhyamika Prasangika, which means the middle way consequent school. So that's the school that most Tibetan lamas follow. And according to that school, the ignorance, which is the root of samsara, is ignorance that grasps self and all other phenomena to exist inherently, objectively, independent of all other things. So it's said that all sentient beings, all beings within samsara, have within their mind this kind of ignorance. And it's been in our mind from beginningless time. It's not that once upon a time we were free of ignorance and we saw things correctly, and then somehow we got polluted and diluted and got ignorant. It's not like that. We've always had ignorance in our mind as long as we've been existing, as long as our mind has been existing. Ignorance has always been there within our mind. And this type of ignorance causes us to see our own I, as inherently existing or objectively existing or independently existing. And we have the same view about everyone else, all other people, all other beings, and all other phenomena. So all the material things in the world around us, all events, all states of mind, absolutely everything, whatever we see. It's almost as if our mind is covered by a veil that causes us to see everything in a distorted way, in a mistaken way, other than how it really is. This is not obvious to recognize. It's something quite subtle. And so the process of recognizing ignorance and how it works, and then undoing it, freeing ourselves from ignorance, is not something easy. Even if we're very intelligent people, even if we've been studying a lot and we may have several degrees, PhDs, we might still be under the influence of this kind of ignorance. And so it takes time. And one needs to study, listen to teachings, study teachings, think about them, discuss them in order to understand the meaning, meditate on them. So it's quite a long process to recognize this ignorance and then undo this ignorance. But we'll just do a little bit here just to get some understanding of what it is. And the antidote, the thing that eliminates ignorance, is the wisdom realizing emptiness. Emptiness meaning emptiness of inherent existence, emptiness of objective existence. That type of existence, that way of existing that ignorance seems to think is there and believes in and grasps at, but is actually not true. It's like a complete fabrication of the mind. So the reality is everything is empty of that mode of existence, inherent existence, independent existence. And so, so there's this wisdom that realizes that. And we first develop this wisdom intellectually, conceptually, by, like I say, studying and thinking and meditating on, and then eventually we get a conceptual understanding of emptiness. But that alone isn't enough to eliminate ignorance. We need to have a direct perception, a direct non-conceptual experience of emptiness. to completely overcome ignorance and the other afflictions. So again, it's a process. But one way we can start to work towards having this wisdom realizing emptiness is to use the reasoning of dependent arising, which means contemplating how everything is dependent. And this is like an antidote, because the ignorance that causes us to see things inherently causes us to see things as if they are independent of everything else, that they are, that things stand alone, autonomously, all by themselves. They don't depend on anything else for their existence. So that's how we see things. And now when some people, when they hear that, might object, and they say, no, that's not true. I know that things depend on other things. I know that I depend on my parents, and I depend on the food that I eat and the people who prepare that food, and so on and so forth. So I know that I'm dependent and not independent. So that may be true, but that's on the intellectual level. That's when you think about it intellectually, you can understand that you are dependent and that other people and other things are dependent. But this ignorance operates in a kind of intuitive or instinctive or gut level way, okay? It's like our gut level way of seeing ourselves and seeing others, okay? And so it's quite subtle. And the best, they say the best opportunity or the best time to see this sense of an independently existing I or independently existing others is when we get emotional, when we get upset. Like, for example, if somebody treats us in a way we don't like, we think, you know, we want people to be nice to us and respect us. And when someone doesn't treat us in a nice and respectful way, and they may be nasty to us, disrespectful, they may even blame us for something we're not responsible for, or accuse us of something we didn't actually do. So in those moments, there's a strong sense of an I coming up. There's a feeling of outrage and injustice. But beneath those feelings, those emotions, there is a sense of an I, a really strong, autonomous, independently existing, objectively existing I didn't do that. How dare you treat me that way? How dare you talk to me that way? So that's what we're talking about here. That very, kind of gut level, instinctive, intuitive sense of self or I. Okay, so that's this sense of an independently existing I that we're trying to target here with this topic of emptiness. And so acquainting ourselves with the fact of dependence, interdependence, how everything exists dependently rather than independently, helps to undermine the sense of independence. Okay, so just understanding dependence itself isn't enough, but it does help. So it said there's 3 ways that things are dependent. One is on causes and conditions. So, for example, our body, the body that we have, we don't remember how it came into existence. We were not aware at that point in time, but we know where babies come from. So we can, understand and imagine that our parents fell in love and got together and had sex, and one sperm from our father got into our mother's womb and fertilized one of her eggs, and that's the start of this body. It started off as this tiny little, I think they call it a zygote, fertilized egg, and that attached itself to the wall of our mother's womb and started growing from there. So we were first just this unrecognizable blob. That was the start of our body. Yeah, it grew, and then eventually got more of a human-like shape with head and arms and so on. And then eventually was born, this little baby. Everybody was excited and delighted and gave us a name and and so on. So that's the start of our body. It came into existence from causes and conditions. And in order to continue existing, we need other causes and conditions. We need food, water, air, medicine when we get sick, and so on and so forth. So it's easy to understand our body depends on causes and conditions. And the same with all the material things in the world around us, furniture, trees, buildings, okay, so they all come about from the causes and conditions. Nothing is there permanently from the beginning, but comes into existence from causes and conditions. So that's not difficult to understand. But again, if we watch our experience, we might recognize that we do tend to see things as if they've always been there. Like when coming here to Sravasti Abbey, you come up the hill and you see these beautiful buildings and think, oh, wow, this is Sravasti Abbey. And there may be this sense like it's always been here. Now, people who lived here for many years know otherwise. They've seen many of the buildings appearing in dependence on many causes and conditions like materials and workers and so on and so forth. But people who weren't here observing that process, and you just arrive and see it, it can seem as if, oh, it's always been here, just like that. Not dependent on causes and conditions. So again, it's just kind of an instinctive, intuitive, gut level way of seeing things. And so it is really, really helpful to contemplate how things do arise from causes and conditions. It takes away some of that heaviness and concreteness that things appear to have otherwise. And I find it really helpful to think about this too with people, especially people that you may get afflicted about, people you find really annoying or irritating, or stir up your negative feelings, anger, irritation, and so on. Or people you feel really attracted to and think, wow, they are wonderful, they are fantastic, they are so attractive, I want to get close to that person. So when we have afflictive emotions coming up towards another person, either aversion or attachment, it can be very helpful to think about how that person came into existence. I just mentioned the starting off as a little blob inside their mother's womb, and just growing from there and becoming a baby and then a little kid. So just really think about that person from that point of view. It really changes the way you see them now, because again, when we see them right now as this really annoying person or this really attractive person, it can seem as if that they've been like that forever. They've always been that way, just the way they appear right now. And that way of seeing them tends to feed or give fuel to our emotions, our attraction or our aversion. So if you think about them as a process, where they came from, in terms of the causes and conditions for their body, and where they're going to later, how they're going to look, next year, and after 10 years, and after 20 years, and after 30 years, and so on and so forth. And you see them in a very different way. And it can kind of pull the rug out from under these afflictive emotions, these painful emotions that we can get caught up in. So it's a very helpful way of dealing with disturbing emotions. And the second way things are dependent is on parts. So that means everything has parts. Everything is made up of parts. So again, our body, Our body has many different parts. When we see a body, whether it's our own body or somebody else's body, it almost appears like one whole, complete thing. But it doesn't take much to understand that that's actually not the case. You know, just look at the drawings in the doctor's offices or in the anatomy books, the photographs of bodies and all the different parts of bodies. So you can sort of mentally dissect a body and think about all the parts that make it up, down to very tiny parts like cells and molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. They haven't found the tiniest particle that's like the building block of everything else. So you get down to that level and it's just like, it gets really weird and inexplicable. Inexplicable. So again, that can be very helpful when it comes to our disturbing emotions. When we have strong attachment for someone or strong aversion for someone, just think about the different parts that make up that person's body. And again, you get a whole different feeling, a whole different sense of what that person is. And that can sort of loosen up the strength of the disturbing emotion you may have towards them. Third way things are dependent. So those first two are not very difficult to understand. And they're even kind of obvious, although we do need to think about them to understand them. But the third one is more difficult. Being labeled by the mind. So everything that exists is labeled by the mind. So using the same example of a body, our own body or somebody else's body, we call it body. And when we don't think about it, just our initial or instinctive gut level way of feeling is body seems to be something existing out there, separate from our mind and also independent of everything else. There seems to be this real kind of solid, concrete body existing out there independently. If a body did exist in that way, we should be able to find it. We should be able to point to something which is that solid, concrete, independently existing body. And so, again, going back to the parts of the body, if we look at all the different parts of the body, can we point to any of the parts that make up the body and say, that is the body? Now, we don't have time to do this here, but I invite you to do it on your own. It's very interesting to do. Look at all the different, or think. You don't have to physically take apart a body. That wouldn't be nice. But mentally take it apart and think about all the different parts and check, where's the body? And so it's pretty obvious that none of the parts of a body is a body. You can't point to a finger and say that's a body, or a nose, or an ear, or even the torso, and say that is a body. But then we tend to think, yeah, none of the parts is the body, but all the parts together, the collection of all the parts, that's a body. Now that seems like, a reasonable thing. But if none of the individual parts is a body, okay, we determine that, go through all the individual parts and decide and be convinced that none of those is a body, then that means they're all non-bodies. They are not bodies. So if you put a whole bunch of non-bodies, things that are not bodies, together in a collection, then how can that be a body? Does a bunch of non-bodies become a body? It seems like that, but think about it in terms of an art collection, okay? Somebody invites you to view their art collection. What do you actually see when you view somebody's art collection? Do you actually see a collection? Or do you see individual works of art? paintings, sculptures, and so on? Is there a collection other than those individual works of art that you can see and enjoy? I don't think so. So collection is, we say collection. Collection is just a name, a term we give to a group of things, a number of items of similar type that happen to be together in relatively the same place. We call that a collection. Okay? Collection isn't anything more than that when it comes to something like an art collection or a coin collection. So when it comes to the body, is the collection of parts of the body parts, which are not bodies, a collection of body parts. Is that really something concrete and real that we can see, that we can perceive, and we can say that is a body? It takes time to think about that, but I invite you to think about that. It's very interesting. So the answer, according to Madhyamika Prasangika, is that body is just a name or a label given to all of those parts, all of those non-bodies, skin, blood, bones, organs, cells, and so on. So just all those different parts, which are not bodies, all of those parts put together, we call it a body. So it's just named, it's just labeled onto the parts. So that's the reality. That's how a body exists, and that's how everything exists. But it's actually completely opposite to the way we normally see things. We see things as other than that. We see things as not just labeled, but as real, existing from their own side, on their own, independently, objectively. But it's not it's not easy to recognize that, because it's the only way we've ever known, the only way we've ever experienced things every single second of our life, and not just this life, but from beginningless time. So our mind is just so thoroughly familiar with and habituated to seeing things as if they were not merely labeled, but existing on their own, independently, inherently. And so, yeah, it takes time to even to understand it intellectually. It can be quite challenging. So we've run out of time. I actually had more. I was going to talk about how the other afflictive emotions come from ignorance, but I'll do that next week. So we'll stop there. And from now until next week, just try to be aware of your mind and aware of afflictive emotions. It's not easy to recognize ignorance. That's quite subtle. But the other two, attachment, also known as craving or grasping, and anger, which has varying levels, starting with irritation, just mild feelings of annoyance and irritation, all the way up to super strong anger, where we may feel like doing something violent. So there's a whole range of different levels of that particular emotion. So just try to notice those in your mind. Try to be aware of them when they're present, and just try to notice what kind of effect they have on you, on your way of thinking and feeling, and your way of relating to other people. Because, according to Buddhism, these are the cause of suffering. And they themselves are suffering when they're present in our mind. We are suffering. We're not peaceful and happy. So just check that out. Just try to notice that. Try to be aware of that. And if you have any questions on what I've covered today, please send them in, and I'll do my best to answer them next time. So we'll finish here today with the recitation of the dedication prayers and prayers for the long lives of our precious teachers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha. and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Okay, thank you. Stay well and see you next week.